Coming at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is the Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson. Today is Tuesday. What we got here? Today is Tuesday, 13th day of August, year of our Lord, 2019. Today's topic, part 5 of economic management, maximizing organizational effectiveness. This is a little thing where I mash up a seance. That's right, of all things. I know those of you who are regular listeners to the show know what I like to do. I like to use my powers as a creepy occultist and practitioner of the black arts and necromancy to summon the spirits of brilliant guys and gals from the past to come help us out and give us guidance in these times of great political and economic turmoil and uncertainty. And today, once again, we're going to be calling forth the spirit of Alfred Marshall. That's right, famed economist Alfred Marshall. We're going to have a team of mediums channeling his spirit, and he's going to be talking about, so you might hear some female voices in there, but don't be alarmed. He's not a trans spirit, I don't think. But these female mediums are sometimes the best. So they say. And anyway, so they will be we'll be channeling the spirit of Alfred Marshall in this seance of the first half, and he's going to be talking about his principles of economics, which coincidentally enough, he wrote a big long thing. Volumes of things that went into a thing he called the principles of economics. So, yeah, I'm sure. Anyway, so, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be doing that in the first half. And then also during the first half, those of you who happen to be watching on YouTube, that's right, we're doing a simulcast, we're doing a blog talk radio show, and live YouTube at the same time. For those of you who might be once again, streaming live again, both on YouTube and on Blog Talk Radio. So just letting everybody know out there. But anyway, for those of you watching, once again, I'm going to be doing while the spirit of Alfred Marshall is giving us guidance in the wild, wonderful world of economics. I am going to be doing motivational 50-year-old crippled guy instructional fitness video. Instructional fitness video. Anyway, I'm going to be showing basically how, a 50-year-old guy running low in testosterone, lifts weights, not really looking to build a whole lot of muscle, but just going for a good stretch. I use very lightweight. I go for about 45-50 minutes. Doing kind of a superset thing. You'll see I just use like this 10-pound therapeutic bar, and I just do some sets, do lots of reps, try and burn as much fat as I can, and get a good stretch, and maintain what little muscle I do still have. Basically, like as usual, I just kind of try to keep it moving for 45-50 minutes, taking breaks in between my sets. My breaks consist of just me count 30 respirations, so that's roughly about 60-second breaks. I know that might be a little too long. I think it's just about right, actually, for my body type, and I don't know. To me, it seems just about the right length. So anyway, I'll be doing that for the first half, and the second half, we're going to get done with that. We're going to close the seance and send Alfred Marshall back to the spirit realm. And then I'm going to be talking about performance management, an essay of an analysis of a book I read and wrote about on my blog, charleslanson.blogspot.com. By the way, hit like and subscribe on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, please. Thank you. And anyway, so we'll be we'll be talking about performance management, and we'll be giving out some management tips and strategies. So you guys will definitely, if you're into that kind of thing, then you're in for a treat, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so without further ado, let's get this shindig started, shall we? Alfred, are you there? Please, come guide us. Share your principles of economics with us.
And raise their wages. But it would injure the makers of roofing tiles as producers of building materials more than it benefited them as consumers. The increase in the supply of this one agent increases the demand for many others by a little, and for some others by much, but for some it lessens the demand. We know that the wages of any worker, say an operative in a boot and shoe factory, tend to equal the net product of his labor. They are not governed by that net product, for net products, like all other incidents of marginal usages, are governed together with value by the general relations of demand and supply. But when, 1, the aggregate application of capital and labor to the boot and shoe industry up to that limit, at which the additional products resulting from any further application could barely be made at profitable rates. 2, the distribution of resources between plant, labor, and other agents of production has been appropriately made. 3, we have in view a factory working with normally good fortune, conducted with normal ability, and where the conditions are such that there is a doubt whether to take on an additional operative of normal ability and energy who offers himself at the normal wage. When all these things are done, then we may fairly conclude that the loss of that man's work would be likely to cause a diminution in the net output of that factory, the value of which was about equal to his wages. The inversion of this statement runs that his wages are about equal to that net product. Of course, the net product of an individual cannot be separated mechanically from that of others who are working together with him. The work done by the various classes of operatives in a boot and shoe factory is not all of the same difficulty, but we may ignore differences in industrial rank between the classes and suppose them to be of all the same rank. This supposition greatly simplifies the wording of the argument without affecting its general character. Now, under the rapidly changing conditions of modern work, one industry or another is apt to be from time to time rather oversupplied or rather undersupplied with labor, and these inevitable inequalities are apt to be increased by restrictive combinations and other influences. But yet the fluidity of labor is sufficient to make it true that the wages of labor of the same industrial grade or rank tend to equality in different occupations throughout the same Western country. Accordingly, no considerable inaccuracy is involved in the statement that, in general, every worker of the same industrial rank with a normal boot operative will be able to buy a pair of boots of any kind, after providing the cost of their material, with the wages earned by him, in about the same time as is required by such an operative to contribute a pair of boots of that kind to the net product of his factory. Putting this statement into a more general form, we may say that every worker will, in general, be able, with the earnings of 100 days' labor, to buy the net products of 100 days' labor of other workers in the same grade with himself. He may select them in whatever way he chooses, so as to make up that aggregate sum. If the normal earnings of workers in another grade are half as high again as his own, the boot operative must spend 3 days' wages in order to get the net product of 2 days' labor of a worker in that grade, and so in proportion. Thus, other things being equal, every increase in the net efficiency of labor in any trade, including his own, will raise in the same proportion the real value of that part of his wages which the boot operative spends on the products of that trade. And other things being equal, the equilibrium level of the real wages of the boot operative depends directly on and varies directly with, the average efficiency of the trades, including his own, which produce those things on which he spends his wages. Conversely, the rejection by the workers in any industry of an improvement by which its efficiency could be increased 10% inflicts on the boot operative an injury measured by 10% of that part of his wages which he spends on the products of that industry. But an increased efficiency on the part of workers whose products compete with his own may injure him temporarily at least, especially if he is not himself a consumer of those products. Again, the boot operative will gain by anything that changes the relative positions of different grades in such a way as to raise his grade relatively to others. He will gain by an increase of medical men whose aid he occasionally needs, and he will gain more if those grades which are occupied chiefly with the tasks of managing business, whether manufacturing, trading, or any other, receive a great influx from other grades, for then the earnings of management will be lowered permanently relative to the earnings of manual work. There will be a rise in the net product of every kind of manual labor, and other things being equal, the boot operative will get more of every commodity on which he spends those wages that represent his own net product. The process of substitution, of which we have been discussing the tendencies, is one form of competition, and it may be well to insist again that we do not assume that competition is perfect. Perfect competition requires a perfect knowledge of the state of the market, and though no great departure from the actual facts of life is involved in assuming this knowledge on the part of dealers, when we are considering the course of business in Lombard Street, the stock exchange, or in a wholesale produce market, it would be an altogether unreasonable assumption to make when we are examining the causes that govern the supply of labor in any of the lower grades of industry. For if a man had sufficient ability to know everything about the market for his labor, he would have too much to remain long in a low grade. The older economists, in constant contact as they were with the actual facts of business life, must have known this well enough, but partly for brevity and simplicity, partly because the term free competition had become almost a catchword, partly because they had not sufficiently classified and conditioned their doctrines, they often seem to imply that they did assume this perfect knowledge. It is therefore especially important to insist that we do not assume the members of any industrial group to be endowed with more ability and forethought, or to be governed by motives other than those which are in fact normal to, and would be attributed by every well-informed person to, the members of that group, account being taken of the general conditions of time and place. There may be a good deal of wayward and impulsive action, sordid and noble motives may mingle their threads together, but there is a constant tendency for each man to select such occupations for himself and his children as seem to him on the whole the most advantageous of those which are within the range of his resources, and of the efforts which he is able and willing to make in order to reach them. The last group of questions, which still remain to be discussed, is concerned with the relation of capital in general to wages in general. It is obvious that though capital in general is constantly competing with labor for the field of employment in particular trades, yet since capital itself is the embodiment of labor as well as of waiting, the competition is really between some kinds of labor aided by a good deal of waiting and other kinds of labor aided by less waiting. When, for instance, it is said that capitalist machinery has displaced much labor that was employed in making boots, what is meant is that formerly there were many who made boots by hand, and a very few who made awls and other simple implements, aided by a little waiting, while now there are rather fewer persons occupied in boot making, and they make a much larger number of boots than before by aid of powerful machines, made by engineers, aided by a good deal of waiting. There is a real and effective competition between labor in general and waiting in general, but it covers a small part of the whole field and is of small importance relatively to the benefits which labor derives from obtaining cheaply the aid of capital, and therefore of efficient methods in the production of things that it needs. For speaking generally, an increase in the power and the willingness to save will cause the services of waiting to be pushed constantly further, and will prevent it from obtaining employment at as high a rate of interest as before. That is, the rate of interest will constantly fall, unless indeed invention opens new advantageous uses of roundabout methods of production. But this growth of capital will increase the national dividend, open out new and rich fields for the employment of labor in other directions, and will thus more than compensate for the partial displacement of the services of labor by those of waiting. The increase of the national dividend owing to the growth of capital and invention is certain to affect all classes of commodities, and to enable the shoemaker, for instance, to purchase with his earnings more food and clothes, more and better supplies of water, artificial light and heat, travel, and so on. It may be admitted that a few improvements affect only commodities consumed by the rich, in the first instance at least, that no part of the corresponding increase of the national dividend goes directly to the laboring classes, and that they do not at once gain anything to compensate for the probable disturbance of some of their members in particular trades. But such cases are rare and generally on a small scale, and even in them there is nearly always some indirect compensation. For improvements designed for the luxuries of the rich soon spread themselves to the comforts of other classes. And though it is not a necessary consequence, yet in fact a cheapening of luxuries does generally lead in various ways to increased desires on the part of the rich for things made by hand and for personal services, and increases also the means at their disposal for gratifying those desires. This points to another aspect of the relation between capital in general and wages in general. It is to be understood that the share of the national dividend which any particular industrial class receives during the year consists either of those things that were made during the year or the equivalents of those things. For many of the things made or partly made during the year are likely to remain in the possession of capitalists and undertakers of industry and to be added to the stock of capital, while in return they, directly or indirectly, hand over to the working classes some things that had been made in previous years. The ordinary bargain between labor and capital is that the wage receiver gets command over commodities in a form ready for immediate consumption, and in exchange carries his employer's goods a stage further towards being ready for immediate consumption. But while this is true of most employees, it is not true of those who finish the process of production. For instance, those who put together and finish watches give to their employers far more commodities in a form ready for immediate consumption than they obtain as wages. And if we take one season of the year with another, so as to allow for seed and harvest time, we find that workmen as a whole hand over to their employers more finished commodities than they receive as wages. There is, however, a rather forced sense in which we may perhaps be justified in saying that the earnings of labor depend upon advances made to labor by capital. For, not to take account of machinery and factories, of ships and railroads, the houses learned to workmen, and even the raw materials in various stages which will be worked up into commodities consumed by them, represent a far greater provision of capital for their use than the equivalent of the advances which they make to the capitalist, even when they work for a month for him before getting any wages. In all this, then, there is nothing to make the relations between capital in general and labor in general differ widely from those between any other two agents of production, in the general scheme of distribution already explained. The modern doctrine of the relations between labor and capital is the outcome to which all the earlier doctrines on the subject were working their way, and differs only in its greater exactness, completeness, and homogeneity from that given by Mill in the 3rd chapter of his 4th book, the only place in which he collects together all the various elements of the problem. To conclude another stage of the argument, capital in general and labor in general cooperate in the production of the national dividend, and draw from it their earnings in the measure of their respective marginal efficiencies. Their mutual dependence is the closest. Capital without labor is dead. The laborer without the aid of his own or someone else's capital would not long be alive. Where labor is energetic, capital reaps a high reward and grows apace, and thanks to capital and knowledge, the ordinary laborer in the Western world is in many respects better fed, clothed, and even housed than were princes in earlier times. The cooperation of capital and labor is as essential as that of the spinner of yarn and the weaver of cloth. There is a little priority on the part of the spinner, but that gives him no preeminence. The prosperity of each is bound up with the strength and activity of the other, though each may gain temporarily, if not permanently, a somewhat larger share of the national dividend at the expense of the other. In the modern world, private employers and officials of joint stock companies, many of whom have but little capital of their own, act as the center of a great industrial wheel. The interests of owners of capital and of workers radiate towards them and from them, and they hold the whole together in a firm grip. They will therefore take a predominant place in those discussions of fluctuations of employment and of wages, which are deferred to the second volume of this treatise, and a prominent, though not predominant, place in those discussions of the secondary features in the mode of action of demand and supply, peculiar to labor, capital, and land respectively, which will occupy the next 8 chapters. In Appendix J, some account will be given of the wages fund doctrine. Reason will be shown for thinking that it laid excessive stress on the side of demand for labor to the neglect of the causes which govern its supply, and that it suggested a correlation between the stock of capital and the flow of wages, instead of the true correlation between the flow of the products of labor aided by capital and the flow of wages. But reason will also be given for the opinion that the classical economists themselves, though perhaps not nearly all their followers, if cross-examined, would have explained away the misleading suggestions of the doctrine, and thus have brought it into close accord, so far as it went, with modern doctrines. In Appendix K, some study will be made of the various kinds of producers' and consumers' surpluses, raising questions of some abstract interest, but of little practical importance. As has already been intimated, the efficiencies, total and marginal, of the several factors of production, their contributions, direct and indirect, to the aggregate net product, or national dividend, and the shares of that dividend which accrue to them severally, are correlated by a number of mutual interactions so complicated that it is impossible to comprehend the whole in a single statement. But yet, by the aid of the terse, compact, precise language of mathematics, it is possible to lead up to a fairly unified general view, though of course it can take no account of differences of quality, except in so far as they can be interpreted more or less crudely into differences of quantity. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Principles of Economics, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 6, by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 3, Earnings of Labor. When discussing the general theory of equilibrium of demand and supply in the last book, and the main outlines of the central problem of distribution and exchange in the first 2 chapters of this book, we left on one side, as far as might be, all considerations turning on the splendid qualities and incidents of the agents of production. We did not inquire in detail how far the general theories of the relations between the value of an appliance for production and that of the product, which it helps to make, are applicable to the incomes earned by natural abilities, or by skill and knowledge acquired long ago, whether in the ranks of the employers, the employed, or the professional classes. We avoided difficulties connected with the analysis of profits, paying no attention to the many different scopes which the usage of the marketplace assigns to this term, and even the more elementary term interest, and we took no account of the influence of varieties of tenure on the farm, of demand for land. These and some other deficiencies will be made good by more detailed analysis in the following 3 groups of chapters on demand and supply in relation to labor, to capital and business power, and to land, respectively. Problems relating to methods of estimating and reckoning earnings, to which the present chapter is devoted, belong mainly to the province of arithmetic or bookkeeping, but much error has arisen from treating them carelessly. When watching the action of demand and supply with regard to a material commodity, we are constantly met by the same difficulty that 2 things which are being sold under the same name in the same market are really not of the same quality and not of the same value to the purchasers. Or if the things are really alike, they may be sold even in the face of the keenest competition at prices which are nominally different, because the conditions of sale are not the same. For instance, a part of the expense or risk of delivery, which is borne in the one case by the seller, may in the other be transferred to the buyer. But difficulties of this kind are much greater in the case of labor than of material commodities. The true price that is paid for labor often differs widely, and in ways that are not easily traced, from that which is nominally paid. There is a preliminary difficulty as to the term efficiency. When it is said that about equal earnings, or rather equal net advantages, see above, 2.4.2 are obtained in the long run in different occupations by persons of about equal efficiency, the term efficiency must be interpreted broadly. It must refer to general industrial efficiency as defined above. But when reference is made to differences of earning power of different people in the same occupation, then efficiency is to be estimated with special reference to those particular elements of efficiency which are needed for that occupation. It is commonly said that the tendency of competition is to equalize the earnings of people engaged in the same trade or in trades of equal difficulty, but this statement requires to be interpreted carefully. For competition tends to make the earnings got by two individuals of unequal efficiency in any given time, say a day or a year, not equal but unequal, and in like manner it tends not to equalize but to render unequal the average weekly wages in two districts in which the average standards of efficiency are unequal. Given that the average strength and energy of the working classes are higher in the north of England than in the south, it then follows that the more completely competition makes things find their own level, the more certain it is that the average weekly wages will be higher in the north than in the south. Cliff Leslie and some other writers have naively laid stress on local variations of wages as tending to prove that there is very little mobility among the working classes, and that the competition among them for employment is ineffective. But most of the facts which they quote relate only to wages reckoned by the day or week. They are only half facts, and when the missing halves are supplied, they generally support the opposite inference to that on behalf of which they are quoted. For it is found that local variations of weekly wages and of efficiency generally correspond, and thus the facts tend to prove the effectiveness of competition, so far as they bear on the question at all. We shall, however, presently find that the full interpretation of such facts as these is a task of great difficulty and complexity. The earnings or wages which a person gets in any given time, such as a day, a week, or a year, may be called his time earnings or time wages, and we may say then that Cliff Leslie's instances of unequal time wages tend on the whole to support, and not to weaken, the presumption that competition adjusts earnings in occupations of equal difficulty and in neighboring places to the efficiency of the workers. But the ambiguity of the phrase, the efficiency of the workers, has not yet been completely cleared away. When the payment for work of any kind is apportioned to the quantity and quality of the work turned out, it is said that uniform rates of piecework wages are being paid, and if two persons work under the same conditions and with equally good appliances, they are paid in proportion to their efficiencies when they receive piecework wages calculated by the same list of prices for each several kind of work. If, however, the appliances are not equally good, a uniform rate of piecework wages gives results disproportionate to the efficiency of the workers. If, for instance, the same lists of piecework wages were used in cotton mills supplied with old-fashioned machinery, as in those which have the latest improvements, the apparent equality would represent a real inequality. The more effective competition is, and the more perfectly economic freedom and enterprise are developed, the more surely will lists be higher in the mills that have old-fashioned machinery than in the others. In order, therefore, to give its right meaning to the statement that economic freedom and enterprise tend to equalize wages in occupations of the same difficulty and in the same neighborhood, we require the use of a new term. We may find it in efficiency wages, or more broadly, efficiency earnings. That is, earnings measured not as time earnings are with reference to the time spent in earning them, and not as piecework earnings are with reference to the amount of output resulting from the work by which they are earned, but with reference to the exertion of ability and efficiency required of the worker. The tendency, then, of economic freedom and enterprise, or in more common phrase, of competition, to cause everyone's earnings to find their own level, is a tendency to equality of efficiency earnings in the same district. This tendency will be the stronger the greater is the mobility of labor, the less strictly specialized it is, the more keenly parents are on the lookout for the most advantageous occupations for their children, the more rapidly they are able to adapt themselves to changes in economic conditions, and lastly, the slower and less violent these changes are. This statement of tendency is, however, still subject to a slight correction, for we have hitherto supposed that it is a matter of indifference to the employer whether he employs few or many people to do a piece of work, provided his total wages bill for the work is the same. But that is not the case. Those workers who earn most in a week when paid at a given rate for their work are those who are cheapest to their employers, and they are the cheapest also to the community, unless indeed they overstrain themselves and work themselves out prematurely. For they use only the same amount of fixed capital as their slower fellow workers, and since they turn out more work, each part of it has to bear a less charge on this account. The prime costs are equal in the two cases, but the total cost of that done by those who are more efficient and get the higher time wages is lower than the total cost of that work done by those who get the lower time wages at the same rate of piecework payment. This point is seldom of much importance in out-of-door work, where there is abundance of room and comparatively little use of expensive machinery, for then, except in the matter of superintendence, it makes very little difference to the employer, whose wages bill for a certain piece of work is £100, whether that sum is divided between 20 efficient or 30 inefficient workers. But when expensive machinery is used which has to be proportioned to the number of workers, the employer would often find the total cost of his goods lowered if he could get 20 men to turn out for a wages bill of £50 as much work as he had previously got done by 30 men for a wages bill of £40. In all matters of this kind, the leadership of the world lies with America, and it is not an uncommon saying there that he is the best businessman who contrives to pay the highest wages. The corrected law then stands that the tendency of economic freedom and enterprise is generally to equalize efficiency, earnings, in the same district, but where much expensive fixed capital is used, it would be to the advantage of the employer to raise the time earnings of the more efficient workers more than in proportion to their efficiency. Of course, this tendency is liable to be opposed by special customs and institutions, and in some cases by trades unions' regulations. Thus much with regard to estimates of the work for which the earnings are given, but next we have to consider most carefully the facts that in estimating the real earnings of an occupation, account must be taken of many things besides its money receipts, and that on the other side of the account we must reckon for many incidental disadvantages besides those directly involved in the strain and stress of the work. As Adam Smith says, the real wages of labor may be said to consist in the quantity of the necessaries and conveniences of life that are given for it, its nominal wages in the quantity of money. The laborer is rich or poor, is well or ill rewarded in proportion to the real, not to the nominal, price of his labor. But the words that are given for it must not be taken to apply only to the necessaries and conveniences that are directly provided by the purchaser of the labor or its products. For account must be taken also of the advantages which are attached to the occupation and require no special outlay on his part. In endeavoring to ascertain the real wages of an occupation at any place or time, the first step is to allow for variations in the purchasing power of the money in which nominal wages are returned. This point cannot be thoroughly dealt with till we come to treat of the theory of money as a whole. But it may be remarked in passing that this allowance would not be a simple arithmetical reckoning, even if we had a perfectly accurate statistics of the history of the price of all commodities. For if we compare distant places or distant times, we find people with different wants and different means of supplying those wants, and even when we confine our attention to the same time and place, we find people of different classes spending their incomes in very different ways. For instance, the prices of velvet, of operatic entertainments and scientific books are not very important to the lower ranks of industry, but a fall in the price of bread or of shoe leather affects them much more than it does the higher ranks. Differences of this kind must always be borne in mind, and it is generally possible to make some sort of rough allowance for them. We have already noticed that a person's total real income is found by deducting from his gross income the outgoings that belong to its production, and that this gross income includes many things which do not appear in the form of money payments and are in danger of being overlooked. Firstly, then, with regard to the outgoings, we do not here reckon the expense of education, general and special, involved in the preparation for any trade, nor do we take any account of the exhaustion of a person's health and strength in his work. Allowance for them may best be made in other ways. But we must deduct all trade expenses, whether they are incurred by professional men or artisans. Thus, from the barrister's gross income, we must deduct the rent of his office and the salary of his clerk. From the carpenter's gross income, we must deduct the expenses which he incurs for tools. And when estimating the earnings of quarrymen in any district, we must find out whether local custom assigns the expenses of tools and blasting powder to them or to their employers. Such cases are comparatively simple, but it is more difficult to decide how large a part of the expenses which a medical man incurs for house and carriage and social entertainments should be regarded as trade expenses. Again, when servants or shop assistants have to supply themselves at their own cost with expensive clothes, which they would not buy if free to do as they liked, the value of their wages to them is somewhat lower by this compulsion. And when the employer provides expensive liveries, house room, and food for his servants, these are generally worth less to them than they cost to him. It is therefore an error to reckon the real wages of domestic servants, as some statisticians have done, by adding to their money wages the equivalent of that cost to their employer of everything that he provides for them. On the other hand, when a farmer hauls coal free for his men, he chooses, of course, times when his horses have little to do, and the real addition to their earnings is much greater than the cost to him. The same applies to many perquisites and allowances, as, for instance, when the employer allows his men to have, without payment, commodities which, though useful to them, are almost valueless to him on account of the great expenses involved in marketing them. Or again, when he allows them to buy for their own use at the wholesale price commodities which they have helped to produce. When, however, this permission to purchase is changed into an obligation to purchase, the door is open to grave abuses. The farmer, who in old times used to compel his men to take from him spoilt grain at the wholesale price of good grain, was really paying them lower wages than he appeared to be. And on the whole, when this so-called truck system prevails in any trade in an old country, we may fairly assume that the real rate of wages is lower than the nominal. Next, we have to take account of the influences exerted on the real rate of earnings in an occupation by the uncertainty of success and the inconstancy of employment in it. We should obviously start by taking the earnings of an occupation as the average between those of the successful and unsuccessful members of it, but care is required to get the true average. For, if the average earnings of those who are successful are £2,000 a year, and of those who are unsuccessful are £400 a year, the average of the whole will be £1,200 a year if the former group is as large as the latter. But if, as is perhaps the case with barristers, the unsuccessful are 10 times as numerous as the successful, the true average is but £550. And further, many of those who have failed most completely are likely to have left the occupation altogether, and thus to escape being counted. And again, though, by taking this average, we obviate the necessity of making any separate allowance for insurance against risk. Account generally remains to be taken of the evil of uncertainty. For there are many people of a sober, steady-going temper who like to know what is before them, and who would far rather have an appointment which offered a certain income of, say, £400 a year, than one which was not unlikely to yield £600, but had an equal chance of affording only £200. Uncertainty, therefore, which does not appeal to great ambitions and lofty aspirations, has special attractions for a very few, while it acts as a deterrent to many of those who are making their choice of a career. And as a rule, the certainty of moderate success attracts more than an expectation of an uncertain success that has an equal actuarial value. But on the other hand, if an occupation offers a few extremely high prizes, its attractiveness is increased out of all proportion to their aggregate value. For this there are two reasons. The first is that young men of an adventurous disposition are more attracted by the prospects of a great success than they are deterred by the fear of failure. And the second is that the social rank of an occupation depends more on the highest dignity and the best position which can be obtained through it than on the average good fortune of those engaged in it. It is an old maxim of statecraft that a government should offer a few good prizes in every department of its service, and in aristocratic countries the chief officials receive very high salaries, while those of the lower grades are comforted in the receipt of salaries below the market level for similar services by their hopes of ultimately rising to a coveted post, and by the social consideration which in such countries always attends on public officers. This arrangement has the incidental effect of favoring those who are already rich and powerful, and partly for that reason it is not adopted in democratic countries. They often go to the opposite extreme and pay more than the market rates for their services to the lower ranks and less to the upper ranks. But that plan, whatever be its merits on other grounds, is certainly an expensive one. We may next consider the influence which inconstancy of employment exerts on wages. It is obvious that in those occupations in which employment is irregular, the pay must be high in proportion to the work done. The medical man and the shoeblack must each receive, when at work, a pay which covers a sort of retaining fee for the time when he has nothing to do. If the advantages of their occupations are in other aspects equal, and their work equally difficult, the bricklayer, when at work, must be paid a higher rate than the joiner, and the joiner than the railway guard. For work on the railways is nearly constant all the year round, while the joiner and the bricklayer are always in danger of being made idle by slackness of trade, and the bricklayer's work is further interrupted by frost and rain. The ordinary method of allowing for such interruptions is to add up the earnings for a long period of time and to take the average of them. But this is not quite satisfactory unless we assume that the rest and leisure which a man gets when out of employment are of no service to him directly or indirectly. This assumption may be fairly made in some cases, for waiting for work often involves so much anxiety and worry that it causes more strain than the work itself would do. But that is not always so. Interruptions of work that occur in the regular course of business, and therefore raise no fears about the future, give opportunity for the system to recruit itself and lay in stores of energy for future exertions. The successful barrister, for instance, is subject to a severe strain during some parts of the year, and that is itself an evil. But when allowance has been made for it, he may be regarded as losing very little by being prevented from earning any fees during the legal vacations. Next, we must take account of the opportunities which a man's surroundings may afford of supplementing the earnings which he gets in his chief occupation by doing work of other kinds. And account may need to be taken also of the opportunities which these surroundings offer for the work of other members of his family. Many economists have even proposed to take as their unit the earnings of a family, and there is much to be said for this plan with reference to agriculture and those old-fashioned domestic trades in which the whole family works together, provided that allowance is made for the loss resulting from any consequent neglect by the wife of her household duties. But in modern England, trades of this kind are exceptional. The occupation of the head of the family seldom exerts much direct influence on those of its other members, except those of his sons whom he introduces into his own trade, though of course when the place in which he works is fixed, the employments to which his family can get easy access are limited by the resources of the neighborhood. Thus then, the attractiveness of a trade depends on many other causes besides the difficulty and strain of the work to be done in it, on the one hand, and the money earnings to be on the other. And when the earnings in any occupation are regarded as acting on the supply of labor in it, or when they are spoken of as being its supply price, we must always understand that the term earnings is only used as a short expression for its net advantages. We must take account of the facts that one trade is healthier or cleaner than another, that it is carried on in a more wholesome or pleasant locality, or that it involves a better social position, as is instanced by Adam Smith's well-known remark that the aversion which many people have for the work of a butcher, and to some extent for the butcher himself, raises earnings in the butcher's trade above those in other trades of equal difficulty. Of course, individual character will always assert itself in estimating particular advantages at a high or a low rate. Some persons, for instance, are so fond of having a cottage to themselves that they prefer living on low wages in the country to getting much higher wages in the town, while others are indifferent as to the amount of house room they get and are willing to go without the comforts of life provided they can procure what they regard as its luxuries. This was the case, for example, with a family of whom the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes in 1884 were told. Their joint earnings were £7 a week, but they chose to live in one room so as to be able to spend money freely on excursions and amusements. Personal peculiarities such as these prevent us from predicting with certainty the conduct of particular individuals. But if each advantage and disadvantage is reckoned at the average of the money values it has for the class of people who would be likely to enter an occupation or to bring up their children to it, we shall have the means of estimating roughly the relative strengths of the forces that tend to increase or diminish the supply of labor in that occupation at the time and place which we are considering. For it cannot be too often repeated that grave errors are likely to result from taking over an estimate of this kind based on the circumstances of one time and place, and applying it without proper precaution to those of another time or another place. In this connection, it is interesting to observe the influence of differences of national temperament in our own time. Thus, in America, we see Swedes and Norwegians drift to agriculture in the Northwest, while the Irish, if they go on the land at all, choose farms in the older eastern states. The preponderance of Germans in the furniture and the brewing industries, of Italians in railway building, of Slavs in meat packing and in some groups of mines, and of Irish and French Canadians in some of the textile industries of the United States, and the preference of the Jewish immigrants in London for the clothing industries and for retail trade. All of these are due partly to differences in national aptitudes, but partly also to differences in the estimates that people of different races form of the incidental advantage and disadvantage of different trades. Lastly, the disagreeableness of work seems to have very little effect in raising wages, if it is of such a kind that can be done by those whose industrial abilities are of a very low order. For the progress of science has kept alive many people who are unfit for any but the lowest grade of work. They compete eagerly for the comparatively small quantity of work for which they are fitted, and in their urgent need they can think almost exclusively of the wages they can earn. They cannot afford to pay much attention to incidental discomforts, and indeed the influence of their surroundings has prepared many of them to regard the dirtiness of an occupation as an evil of but minor importance. Hence arises the paradoxical result that the dirtiness of some occupations is a cause of the lowness of the wages earned in them. For employers find that this dirtiness adds much to the wages they would have to pay to get the work done by skilled men of high character working with improved appliances, and so they often adhere to old methods which require only unskilled workers of but indifferent character, and who can be tired for low time wages because they are not worth much to any employer. There is no more urgent social need than that labor of this kind should be made scarce, and therefore dear. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Principles of Economics, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 6 by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 4. Earnings of Labor Continued. The action of demand and supply with regard to labor was discussed in the last chapter with reference to the difficulties of ascertaining the real, as opposed to the nominal, price of labor. But some peculiarities in this action remain to be studied, which are of a more vital character, for they affect not merely the form, but also the substance of the action of the forces of demand and supply, and to some extent they limit and hamper the free action of those forces. We shall find that the influence of many of them is not at all to be measured by their first and most obvious effects, and that these effects which are cumulative are generally far more important in the long run than those which are not, however prominent the latter may appear. The problem has thus much in common with that of the tracing of the economic influence of custom, for it has already been noticed, and it will become more clear as we go on, that the direct effects of custom in causing a thing to be sold for a price, sometimes a little higher and sometimes a little lower than it would otherwise fetch, are not really of very great importance, because any such divergence does not, as a rule, tend to perpetuate and to increase itself, but on the contrary, if it becomes considerable, it tends itself to call into action forces that counteract it. Sometimes these forces break down the custom altogether, but more often they evade it by gradual and imperceptible changes in the character of the thing sold, so that the purchaser really gets a new thing at the old price under the old name. These direct effects then are obvious, but they are not cumulative. On the other hand, the indirect effects of custom in hindering the methods of production and the character of producers from developing themselves freely are not obvious, but they generally are cumulative, and therefore exert a deep and controlling influence over the history of the world. If custom checks the progress of one generation, then the next generation starts from a lower level than it would otherwise have done, and any retardation which it suffers itself is accumulated and added to that of its predecessor, and so on from generation to generation. And so it is with regard to the action of demand and supply on the earnings of labor. If at any time it presses hardly on any individuals or class, the direct effects of the evils are obvious. But the sufferings that result are of different kinds, those the effects of which end with the evil by which they were caused, and are not generally to be compared in importance with those that have the indirect effect of lowering the character of the workers, or of hindering it from becoming stronger. For these last cause further weakness and further suffering, which again in their turn cause yet further weakness and further suffering, and so on cumulatively. On the other hand, high earnings and a strong character lead to greater strength and higher earnings, which again lead to still greater strength and still higher earnings, and so on cumulatively. The first point to which we have to direct our attention is the fact that human agents of production are not bought and sold as machinery and other material agents of production are. The worker sells his work, but he himself remains his own property. Those who bear the expense of rearing and educating him receive but very little of the price that is paid for his services in later years. Whatever deficiencies the modern methods of business may have, they have at least this virtue, that he who bears the expenses of production of material goods receives the price that is paid for them. He who builds factories or steam engines or houses or rears slaves reaps the benefit of all net services which they render so long as he keeps them for himself, and when he sells them he gets a price which is the estimated net value of their future services, and therefore he extends his outlay until there seems to him no good reason for thinking that the gains resulting from any further investment would compensate him. He must do this prudently and boldly, under the penalty of finding himself worsted in competition with others who follow a broader and more far-sighted policy, and ultimately disappearing from the ranks of those who direct the course of the world's business. The action of competition and the survival in the struggle for existence of those who know best how to extract the greatest benefits for themselves from the environment tend in the long run to put the building of factories and steam engines into the hands of those who will be ready and able to incur every expense which will add more than its cost to their value as productive agents. But the investment of capital in the rearing and early training of the workers of England is limited by the resources of parents in the various grades of society, by their power of forecasting the future, and by their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their children. This evil is indeed of comparatively small importance with regard to the higher industrial grades, for in those grades most people distinctly realize the future and discount it at a low rate of interest. They exert themselves much to select the best careers for their sons, and the best trainings for those careers, and they are generally willing and able to incur a considerable expense for the purpose. The professional classes especially, while generally eager to save some capital for their children, are even more on the alert for opportunities of investing it in them. And whenever there occurs in the upper grades of industry a new opening for which an extra and special education is required, the future gains need not be very high relatively to the present outlay, in order to secure a keen competition for the post. But in the lower ranks of society the evil is great, for the slender means and education of the parents, and the comparative weakness of their power of distinctly realizing the future, prevent them from investing capital in the education and training of their children with the same free and bold enterprise with which capital is applied to improving the machinery of any well-managed factory. Many of the children of the working classes are imperfectly fed and clothed. They are housed in a way that promotes neither physical nor moral health. They receive a school education which, though in modern England it may not be very bad so far as it goes, yet only goes a little way, and they have few opportunities of getting a broader view of life or an insight into the nature of the higher work of business, of science, or art. They meet hard and exhausting toil early on the way, and for the greater part of it keep to it all their lives. At least they go to the grave carrying with them undeveloped abilities and faculties, which, if they could have borne full fruit, would have added to the material wealth of the country, to say nothing of higher considerations, many times as much as would have covered the expense of providing adequate opportunities for their development. But the point on which we have specially to insist now is that this evil is cumulative. The worse fed are the children of one generation, the less will they earn when they grow up, and the less will be their power of providing adequately for the material wants of their children, and so on to following generations. And again, the less fully their own faculties are developed, the less will they realize the importance of developing the best faculties of their children, and the less will be their power of doing so. And conversely, any change that awards to the workers of one generation better earnings, together with better opportunities of developing their best qualities, will increase the material and moral advantages which they have the power to offer to their children, while by increasing their own intelligence, wisdom, and forethought, such a change will also, to some extent, increase their willingness to sacrifice their own pleasures for the well-being of their children, though there is much of that willingness now, even among the poorest classes, so far as their means and the limits of their knowledge will allow. The advantages which those born in one of the higher grades of society have over those born in a lower consist in a great measure of the better introductions and the better start in life which they receive from their parents, and the importance of this good start in life is nowhere seen more clearly than in a comparison of the fortunes of the sons of artisans and of unskilled laborers. There are not many skilled trades to which the son of an unskilled laborer can get easy access, and in the large majority of cases the son follows the father's calling. In the old-fashioned domestic industries this was almost a universal rule, and even under modern conditions, the father has often great facilities for introducing his son to his own trade. Employers and their foremen generally give to a lad whose father they already know and trust a preference over one for whom they would have to incur the entire responsibility. And in many trades a lad, even after he has got entrance to the works, is not very likely to make good progress and obtain a secure footing unless he is able to work by the side of his father, or some friend of his father's, who will take the trouble to teach him and to let him do work that requires careful supervision, but has an educational value. And the son of the artisan has further advantages. He generally lives in a better and cleaner house, and under material surroundings that are more consistent with refinement than those with which the ordinary laborer is familiar. His parents are likely to be better educated and to have a higher notion of their duties to their children. And last but not least, his mother is likely to be able to give more of her time to the care of her family. If we compare one country of the civilized world with another, or one part of England with another, or one trade in England with another, we find that the degradation of the working classes varies almost uniformly with the amount of rough work done by women. The most valuable of all capital is that invested in human beings, and of that capital the most precious part is the result of the care and influence of the mother, so long as she retains her tender and unselfish instincts, and has not been hardened by the strain and stress of unfeminine work. This draws our attention to another aspect of the principle already noticed, that in estimating the cost of production of efficient labor, we must often take our unit as the family. At all events, we cannot treat the cost of production of efficient men as an isolated problem. It must be taken as part of the broader problem of the cost of production of efficient men, together with the women who are fitted to make their homes happy, and to bring up their children vigorous in body and mind, truthful and cleanly, gentle and brave. As the youth grows up, the influence of his parents and his schoolmaster declines, and thenceforward to the end of his life his character is molded chiefly by the nature of his work, and the influence of those with whom he associates for business, for pleasure, and for religious worship. A good deal has already been said of the technical training of adults.
Okay, thank you, Alfred. That'll be enough of that. Here's a little Tibetan bowl music to send you off. Be gone, Oh, vile spirit. Oh, vile economist spirit. Okay, I'm just joking, Alfred. I don't think you're a vile spirit. I'm sure you're in heaven or economist heaven. Actually, I don't know. I don't really know what his personal life was like. I know he was married. His wife helped him a lot in that work, Principles of Economics, from what I've heard. It's the word on the street, Huggy Bear. All right, so, ladies and gents, be gone, spirit, until I call ye forth again for our next installment of economic management, maximizing organizational effectiveness. Now is the part of the show where we talk more about contemporary modern day management practices. Though a lot of the stuff Alfred Marshall wrote about back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, still very applicable today. And but just to round out and fill out the conversation a little bit further, we're going to be talking about performance management. Okay, I'll be citing my sources here in a minute, so don't call me a plagiarist. Dang it. All right, here we go. Let me see here. Okay. Here we go. The right pinpoint. All of us at one time or another face the challenge of distinguishing between the important and the urgent. Depending on the immediacy of consequences, even the trivial can become urgent. When consequences are delayed, the important can lose urgency. In this section, I describe the process of identifying the most important result of a job or an organization, its mission. Once specified, this result lays the groundwork for all further pinpointing. The mission. It's very important. Identifying the mission. The right pinpoint always begins with identifying the outcome you want. There are relatively, and once again, pinpoints, if you remember from the last show, very important in the world of performance management, pinpointing. And because you have to describe the exact behavior you would like to see, or you can't be vague about giving orders, barking out orders. That's right. You have to be very precise in your pinpointing. Identifying the mission is a good way to do that. All right. So there are relatively few times outside of raising children when you want to change behavior only for the sake of behavior change. This is particularly true in an organizational setting. Yet we see people expend considerable effort and resources attempting to change behaviors that have little, if any, impact on organizational performance. Most often, they try to punish behaviors because the behaviors are annoying. Nuisance behaviors, such as complaining, being tardy to meetings, overstaying breaks, and the like, cause others anguish because of the way they value the appropriate behaviors. Okay, I can't remember if I talked about this or not. It's starting to seem a little. Let me see. In the last show, let me see here. If not, I'll move on. We also, but if not, if it does sound a little redundant, it sounds like I talked about this in the last show. It could be because I wrote about it on my blog too, not long ago. But anywho, we'll see. I might end up just moving on if I feel like being a little too redundant here. We also find people reinforcing behaviors that have little organizational value. Since you will get more of what you reinforce, this sometimes causes a problem because reinforcing the wrong thing gets you more of the wrong thing. You may reinforce something that contributes little to the desired result or that takes time and energy away from behaviors that are important to success. One of the greatest challenges to building a positive work environment is the matter of contingency, or what you reinforce. Too many people reinforce trivial behaviors and ignore those that really matters. And ignore those that really matter. I guess that's more proper English there. When deciding what to reinforce, always start with the outcome. But keep in mind that selecting the right outcome requires some thought. When managers are inundated with data on every facet of performance, how do they pinpoint behaviors that will make a difference? The answer is to begin by defining the mission. We define the mission as the reason the organization or the job exists. It is the single most important outcome associated with success. A mission statement does not define everything you must accomplish to be successful, only the core outcomes. Usually, this is a 3 to 5 word statement of why the job exists. There are two kinds of missions, organizational and job. At the organizational level, the mission is a short, pithy statement that defines what the customer values in your product or service. The mission for a nuclear power plant might be as simple as generate power. Usually, these statements are wordier in an attempt to make them motivational to many constituencies. This is fine as long as the essential statement is clear and not obscured by the verbiage. This same type of mission statement applies to internal units of the company. The sales department's mission, for example, should state as simply as possible the essential outcome of its efforts, contracted sales, for example. Managers should not confuse their function's mission with their own. If a sales manager's unit mission is to sell insurance, she should know that is not her function. Her boss should use sales data not to reinforce or punish, but for analysis of her unit's performance. The sales manager's consequences should come primarily from what she personally contributes to the sales effort and success. This is usually defined by her job mission. How do we identify and quantify how her personal role contributes to the sales effort and success? This is usually defined by her job mission. How do we identify and quantify how her personal role contributes to the success of her unit? Most managers have worked for someone at some point in their career who was promoted not because of their competence, but in spite of their incompetence. This occurs because that manager's bosses only looked at the unit performance and mistook it as a reflection of the manager's performance. Just as every organization has its mission to perform, each job has a mission that contributes to that organizational mission. This is true of work at all levels, from the president to the head of research and development. to the customer service representative in the call center. Once the job has been identified, measures and subordinate pinpoints flow naturally from it. However, the vague description of a personal supervisor's job as supporting the organization by providing human resources does not naturally lead to job measures. Words that denote process or how you will do something generally are fatal to mission statements. But if you describe the same mission as an outcome, such as job positions filled, several possible measures become apparent. They are percent of job positions filled, time required to fill open positions, percent of job openings with qualified applicants available, and percentage of new hires retained after probationary period. Missions are statements of outcomes, not of activities. In other words, missions should describe pinpointed results, not pinpointed behaviors. Once you have defined the mission, measures of quantity, quality, timeliness, and cost naturally follow. The resulting measures will focus your efforts on the critical issues. Most jobs require many behaviors and produce many results. Until you know the most important result, priorities are often confused, and much time and energy is wasted changing behaviors that are insignificant or, in some cases, counterproductive. So, the best way to determine a job mission is to start by listing all the results and key activities of the job with appropriate measures. Then try to summarize in one short statement why the performers do these things. The outcome of the combination of these activities. The single most important result of the job is the job mission. Once you have a mission, go back and check all other results against it. If achieving these results does not help achieve the mission, they are secondary to the mission, or they belong to some other job. The process of identifying the most important results of a job consists of these 3 steps. 1. List all the results and key behaviors for which you are accountable. 2. Extract from the list a single result that explains why the job exists. 3. Check each remaining result against the mission and determine which results are critical to the accomplishment of the mission. Okay, an example of a job's mission. Let's illustrate this process by looking at the job of a personnel supervisor mentioned earlier. The job of personnel supervisor mentioned earlier. The following list contains some possible important results for this position. Important possible results for the position of personnel supervisor. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission requirements met. EEOC requirements met. Employee files current. New applicant files available. Recruiting interviews conducted. Exit interviews conducted. Jobs filled with qualified personnel. Job openings filled within target time. With this list, it is easy to see that the one overall result the job is directed toward is jobs filled. There you go. So I would just like to give props where props are due right now in this portion of economic management, maximizing organizational effectiveness. I'm borrowing heavily from this work here, Performance Management, Changing Behavior That Drives Organizational Effectiveness, 4th edition, 2004, Aubrey C. Daniels and James E. Daniels are the writers of this book, which I read and I did the analysis of. It was okay. I liked it. I guess, but I'm just, since it is an analysis, I have to throw my opinion in here sometimes. But still, a lot of good, juicy tips. I probably wouldn't recommend it though. I would just recommend other stuff. But sorry, Daniels is. But there was still a lot of good stuff in there, and so I don't. But then again, it's everybody, whatever. So that's just my 2 cents. Is it even appropriate to give? I don't know. If I'm doing an analysis of someone's work, to say whether or not I recommend it. I don't really know. It's just okay. I guess not. I guess I should keep this analysis impartial. It's not an opinion piece, is it? No, it's just an analysis. It's not a critique. Okay, or so whatever. Here we go. Finding and creating positive reinforcers. Shorthand for positive reinforcers is R plus. One of the questions most often asked by managers when they are first exposed to behavior analysis is, how do you choose good reinforcers? The next most popular question is, what do you do if you don't have any money for reinforcers? This section is designed to answer those questions. Finding effective reinforcers. People's varied likes and dislikes complicate the problem of finding effective reinforcers. Because no two people have exactly the same reinforcers. In one of our PMs, let's see here. In an APR PM seminar, the writers of this book that I'm analyzing asked participants to make a list of their reinforcers. Since many of us have reinforcers that are the same or similar, we can efficiently manage groups of people. However, the larger the group, the lower the probability that any single reinforcer you choose will be a reinforcer for everyone. So how then do you find the reinforcers for the people at work? This section will give you some ways to simplify the task. Wants, desires, values, and reinforcers. Agua here. In attempting to find an effective reinforcer, it is helpful to think in terms of what the person or group wants, desires, and values. However, people's wants, desires, or values are not identical to reinforcers. You may say you want, desire, or value something, but not willing to increase a particular behavior or performance to get it. And even if you think you would work for it, you might not. Even though wants, desires, and values are not the equivalent of reinforcers, they are helpful to know when trying to discover reinforcers. If the wants, desires, and values of other people are the same as ours, we will probably have many reinforcers in common. But in the final analysis, no matter what we call it, if it doesn't increase the behavior, it is not a reinforcer. One of the most common errors made in choosing reinforcers for others is that we assume they want what we want, even when there are large differences in age, education, social status, and culture. Many managers, for example, offer to take a top performer and spouse to dinner at a fancy restaurant when that is the last thing the couple wants. They may prefer beer and pizza or dinner without the boss. Compliments of the company. Of course, the opposite mistake is also made when we assume that because of someone's background or job position, they would prefer beer and pizza, when in fact they would rather go to an upscale restaurant. Holy moly, I'm thinking I might have messed something up here. Yeah, I did. Okay, I was getting ahead of myself. Yeah, because I was talking about pinpointing before. I got way ahead of myself when I started talking about this. So yeah, finding and creating positive reinforcers. Okay. Um, yeah, we're just forget I said anything. We're gonna come back to that at a different point in time in the future. But for right now, we're gonna be. I was talking about pinpointing before and the importance of pinpointing and why it is important to emphasize behaviors or results, which leads us to a pretty timely story, which is the Trump PP-gate Russian collusion witch hunt. Behaviors or results, which should you emphasize? Every job was created to produce particular results. Clearly, then, results always need to be pinpointed. And if something is worth pinpointing, it is worth measuring. Therefore, one simple rule that we can state concerning behaviors and results is this: pinpoint both behaviors and results, but always pinpoint and measure results first. However, the Trump PP-gate Russian collusion witch hunt is a perfect example of what can go wrong when only results are pinpointed. The necessity for pinpointing and measuring at least some of the behaviors required to produce results may not be clear to some people. Why worry about the means behavior if the end result is justified in being accomplished? The answer is that if you do not pinpoint relevant behaviors, one or more of the following problems may occur. 1. People may engage in illegal or morally reprehensible behavior, such as falsifying data. 2. Behaviors necessary for the maintenance of long-term results may be neglected. 3. You may set up negative reinforcement contingencies that suboptimize performance. The Trump PP-gate Russian collusion witch hunt scandal that has led to the implosion of the Democratic Party is an example of the first type of problem. In that case, individuals were told to obtain certain information about the then presidential candidate, Donald Trump. The result, electing a Democrat president, was the important thing. Any behaviors that would lead to that end were considered justifiable by those involved and were reinforced by their superiors. As a consequence, those involved committed crimes, behaviors that included illegal spying, the secret surveillance of Trump Tower, and falsifying intelligence reports, the bogus PP-gate dossier. The course of American history has been dramatically altered as a result. Those involved could have attended speeches by the Republican politicians. They could have talked to supporters and reporters. They could have analyzed the information obtained to understand the strategy the Donald Trump campaign was taking. These are all legal activities, behaviors directed toward the same end as the illegal surveillance and colluding with a foreign country to produce falsified intelligence reports. Obviously, monitoring to see that the results were obtained by legal behaviors rather than illegal ones would have averted a major political scandal and saved the country countless dollars in untold grief. Newspapers and television news constantly report problems of this nature. Under pressure to win, the result, college coaches engage in illegal behavior to recruit star high school athletes. Athletes use steroids and other illegal substances behavior in an attempt to set performance records. The result, the list seems endless. Systems that emphasize results to the exclusion of behaviors may encourage otherwise law-abiding individuals to perform illegal, immoral, or unethical acts. Managers who focus exclusively on results may unwittingly create lying, cheating, and stealing. This is a frequent occurrence when there is a lot of pressure to produce results or else lose one's job or status within the organization. If the employees know the boss is only interested in the results, they may falsify the data or engage in other behavior that is even more reprehensible to avoid the punishment for not achieving those results. Another problem that occurs when only results are evaluated is that behaviors necessary for long-term results will be neglected. In other words, short-term gains will be reinforced at the expense of long-term results. For example, preventative maintenance may be neglected in order to maximize short-term productivity. Of course, this may cause equipment failure in the long run and subsequent production losses far in excess of that gain from not doing the required maintenance. When the pressure is to get it out the door, quality may suffer in favor of meeting a shipping schedule. An organization is headed for trouble when you hear managers say things like, "I don't care how you do it, I want those chemicals disposed of by the end of the month." Or, "I don't care how you do it, but you would better make those budget cuts by the end of the month." Or, "I don't care how you do it, take out Trump." In essentially every case, you should pinpoint and monitor behaviors and results. Even though you should monitor both, you will usually need to focus on one or the other. The Trump PP-gate Russian collusion witch hunt shows us what happens when only results are pinpointed to the exclusion of behaviors. Moving on. Managing by wandering around. MBWA. In their best-selling book, In Search of Excellence, Peters and Waterman, 1982, introduced the concept of MBWA, managing by wandering around. This immediately caught the attention of many managers because the authors claimed it was associated with excellence. It made sense. It confirmed the practice of many, and it was easy. Immediately upon reading the book, many managers who had not spent much time in the work area started frequenting the workplace, only to create chaos rather than excellence. The reason was they didn't know what to do in the workplace while they were there. The manager's presence in the workplace may be an antecedent for both punishment and reinforcement. Unfortunately, in some cases, it resulted in more punishment to both management and non-management. In such cases, the manager used the wandering to learn what was going wrong rather than what was going right. A more serious problem is that an upper-level manager who wanders around without the frontline supervisor may reinforce or punish the wrong behaviors. This can happen for two reasons. One, take a drink of water here. 1, the manager may not know the proper methods or procedures that are supposed to be followed in the conduct of the job. Although a manager may have at one time been an expert on a particular job, being away from it every day may mean he or she is not aware of new methods. This could lead to reinforcing a performance that is not up to date or punishing one that is. 2, the manager may draw conclusions about the performance from too little data because the wandering is infrequent. When going on the floor, a manager might catch a performer sitting down and punish him when he was resting from doing something extraordinary. On the other hand, he might provide reinforcement to someone who appears to be working, not knowing that she had been causing problems with coworkers and supervisors all day and only started working when he arrived. The way to apply MBWA correctly is to wander with a purpose and in the company of a supervisor. Following are some tips for making MBWA successful through work sampling. 1. One purpose of work sampling when down at levels below your direct reports is to determine how well your organizational structure functions. When you talk to individuals, you are trying to diagnose the antecedents and consequences that drive their performance. Under the heading of antecedents, you want to know if their process is capable of producing what you want or if it interferes with performance. Are there interference issues that you need to resolve? Are communications of the most important issues clearly understood? Under the heading of consequences, you need to know if your policies and programs promote performance or interfere with it. Does the structure of the work encourage performance or interfere with it? Does the structure of the performance, does the structure of the work encourage performance or make good work difficult? You should also find information that tells you which performance systems work, whether incentives, promotions, or procedures are working, and which ones need altering. 2, the second purpose of work sampling is to determine how well your management process works. Here, you are looking at how people are managed. Your purpose is not to correct individual deficiencies or to reinforce behavior as you observe, though that might seem to be an inevitable part of your investigation. Correcting and reinforcing are functions of the immediate supervisor. Your purpose is to determine how effective your managers are at promoting discretionary behavior from their direct reports. Are they using their resources wisely and well? Are your managers participating in the process or are they impeding the process? You should expect to collect information that allows you to reinforce your direct report's contributions to success or information that allows you to more effectively pinpoint managerial behaviors to coach. 3, sample work with the supervisor to ensure that you both are seeing the same things and to train him on what your criteria for success are. If you both see the same things, you will quickly calibrate what is important and what is not. Your commentary should be directed at the supervisor rather than at the performer. If something is done well, it is the supervisor who should be the target of your comments. If something is not done well, it is the supervisor who provides you with the information you need to be an effective participant in its correction. 4, use this opportunity to strengthen the position of the supervisor rather than undercutting it. This means that you reinforce individuals only at the supervisor's direction. Your goal is to have her direct reports see that their boss is a contributing part of the reinforcement process. This pairing of reinforcement with upper management will make the supervisor's social reinforcement more powerful. When you must correct a direct report, do it privately. Consequences delivered by higher levels of management directly to the individuals involved without the participation of the supervisor can weaken the supervisor's ability to manage. Most of the wandering around that any supervisor should do is among direct reports. While it is reinforcing for many managers to see the frontline activity in the organization, the primary responsibility of a manager is to reinforce direct reports. Upper managers should assist in reinforcing at all levels, but usually at the direction of lower level managers or supervisors. Komaki, 1986, discovered that most effective supervisors and managers spent more time in what she called job sampling than the ineffective ones did. You can only deliver positive or immediate consequences to your direct reports when you are in the work area. Managers who opt to stay in their offices can only provide consequences for results, not the behaviors that produce them. Because of this, MBWA should be a part of every reinforcement plan. It is not something you do separately from performance management. It is an integral part of the PM process. Performance management, PM. So if you hear me saying PM, that's what I'm talking about. All right, moving on. Okay, finding and creating positive reinforcers. This sounds a little familiar. That's because I skipped ahead a little while earlier, but so we're going to go ahead and go over what I went over before, just to catch us up to speed. One of the questions most often asked by managers when they are first exposed to behavior analysis is, how do you choose good reinforcers? The next most popular question is, what do you do if you don't have any money for reinforcers? This section is designed to answer those questions. Finding effective reinforcers. People's varied likes and dislikes complicate the problem of finding effective reinforcers because no two people have exactly the same reinforcers. In one of our PM seminars, we asked participants to make a list of their reinforcers. Since many of us have reinforcers that are the same or similar, we can efficiently manage groups of people. However, the larger the group, the lower the probability that any single reinforcer you choose will be a reinforcer for everyone. How then do you find the reinforcers for the people at work? This section here will give you some ways to simplify the task. Wants, desires, values, and reinforcers. In attempting to find an effective reinforcer, it is helpful to think in terms of what the person or group wants, desires, and values. However, people's wants, desires, or values are not identical to reinforcers. You may say you want, desire, or value something, but not willing to increase a particular behavior or performance to get it. And even if you think you would work for it, you might not. Even though wants, desires, and values are not the equivalent of reinforcers, they are helpful to know when trying to discover reinforcers. If the wants, desires, and values of other people are the same as ours, we will probably have many reinforcers in common. But in the final analysis, no matter what we call it, if it doesn't increase the behavior, it is not a reinforcer. One of the most common errors made in choosing reinforcers for others is that we assume they want what we want, even when there are large differences in age, education, social status, and culture. Many managers, for example, offer to take a top performer and spouse to dinner at a fancy restaurant when that is the last thing the couple wants. They may prefer beer and pizza or dinner with the boss, compliments of the company. Of course, the opposite mistake is also made when we assume that because of someone's background or job position, they would prefer beer and pizza when in fact they would rather go to an upscale restaurant. This highlights an important feature of the performance management PM process. It is the most individually centered management approach available today. It starts from a premise that everyone is different. You will never maximize the potential of an organization if you treat people as stereotypes of any kind. Individuals have a rich history of reinforcement that they bring to the workplace. Many kinds of behavior patterns remain once. Oh, leave me alone, please. Thank you. Okay, it is the most individually centered management approach available today. It starts from a premise that everyone is different. You will never maximize the potential of an organization if you treat people as stereotypes of any kind. Individuals have a rich history of reinforcement that they bring to the workplace. Many kinds of behavior patterns remain once individuals enter the work setting. Because historically based reinforcers continue to occur across settings. Finding distinctive reinforcers for each person that either help to initiate new behaviors or maintain established patterns of behavior is one of the best opportunities managers have to recognize the uniqueness of every employee. While this may sound like a very complicated task, it is not very difficult. The vast majority of things that we find reinforcing can be discovered by using the processes defined right here. Performance management works everywhere. PM methods have been applied successfully in over 20 countries. All cultural practices reflect unique histories of reinforcement, and certainly the wonderful variations in cultural practices are important to understand. However, the reason people of all nationalities behave as they do is because they are people who learn through the selective power of particular reinforcers that sustain behavior, regardless of country or culture or origin. The variety of individual wants and needs is as infinite as the variety of people. Because of this, PM will not work effectively unless the individual's reinforcers are identified. At first glance, it appears that choosing effective reinforcers for one person is difficult and for a group impossible. Fortunately, there are things that seem to transcend all of our differences. For example, most people of all ages, education, social status, and culture respond favorably to expressions of appreciation for good work. There are other reinforcers that people respond to, but the question is, How do I find which reinforcers apply to the individuals with whom I work? 3 methods of identifying reinforcers are asking, observing, and testing. 1. Asking people what they like. One way to identify effective reinforcers for people is by talking to them. Asking them what non-work activities they spend time and money pursuing. Do they hunt, jog, ski, read, or play a musical instrument? The simple act of talking to people about something they are interested in is practically always a reinforcer. For example, spending some time talking to someone about her family or her hobby is usually reinforcing. Sometimes when you ask people to tell you what they want or like, you may set up false expectations. When you ask the question, be sure to let them know that you want to know the types of things they like or enjoy. Tell them that you may not arrange for every particular reinforcer they mention, but they should not be afraid to list every reinforcer that comes to mind. Who knows? You may do something that they didn't think you could. Knowing what people like, however outrageous their choices may be, will help you to know them better, and as such, will give you ideas for reinforcers that you can provide. 2. Observing people. Even though common sense seems to indicate that asking would be the best way to find reinforcers, it is not. When you begin to reinforce, it is usually better to start with one of several other methods for determining individual and group reinforcers. Once people have experienced reinforcement at work or are trained in the approach, asking is an efficient way to learn about reinforcers. In the meantime, observation is a very efficient way to discover effective reinforcers. The observing method is officially called the Premack principle. The Premack principle involves observing people to see what they do when they have a choice. The Premack principle is also the basis for a very effective time management system. You can test this method for yourself. First, take all the tasks that you have to do and arrange them from the most preferred task to the least preferred one. Then perform each task, starting at the bottom with the least preferred task. When you start at the bottom of the list, observe what happens when you complete tasks. As you complete a lesser preferred task, you get to engage in a more preferred one, the next one on the list. Notice what happens when you start at the top, where most people begin. Every time you complete a preferred task, the next one is less preferred. The first method creates a type of reinforcement system. The second is a punishment system. The first produces industriousness and the second procrastination. 3. Trial and error. Testing a consequence to see if it's a reinforcer. And we will get into that. I'm going to take a quick break. Return right after these words, or not words, but right after these easily listening sounds of the Tibetan healing bowls. Tibetan healing sounds, singing bowls, natural sounds, gold for meditation and relaxation. So let all this info sink in for a few minutes. I shall return and we will end the show. But be back right after this. 3, trial and error. Testing a consequence to see if it's a reinforcer. Probably the most frequently used method for finding reinforcers is to try something and see if it works. This works an amazingly high percentage of the time. This trial and error method is really a combination of asking and observing. Before trying something, people often do some observing, talking, and listening. They also usually talk to those who have used reinforcers before, or they may try something they have read about that worked in another setting similar to theirs. You may get some negative reactions when you first start to use reinforcement. People may scoff at or even laugh at your efforts. Most of the time, a negative reaction is because they are not accustomed to reinforcement in the workplace. The good news is that such rejection doesn't happen often, and when it does occur, it is usually short-lived. Believe it or not, sometimes when people protest that they don't need reinforcement, their performance still increases after they get it. This is why it is important not to rely solely on verbal behavior when finding reinforcers. You need to monitor performance data carefully to determine if you have an effective reinforcer. Moving on. Okay, tangible reinforcers. When most people hear the concept of positive reinforcement, they usually think of money or something that money can buy. Social reinforcers, smiles, acceptance, praise, acclaim, attention from other people, compose the class of reinforcers that we rely on for most organizational improvement. However, even though tangible reinforcers are not often used, they are an important part of one's reinforcement repertoire. A tangible reinforcer is any economically valuable object or activity that is presented contingent on, based on, or after a behavior that results in an increase in the frequency of that behavior. A discrimination needs to be reiterated at this point. A tangible delivered contingent on some behavior is a reinforcer. A tangible delivered sometime after the performance is a reward. Tangibles are typically rewards rather than reinforcers. It is not often that you deliver some tangible during or immediately on completion of behavior. You might, however, deliver a cup of specialty coffee to someone who is working late to complete a project, or you might let someone leave work an hour early after they have calmed an angry customer and thus retained an important sale. If the rewards are meaningful to the recipients and you deliver them appropriately, your presence will be paired with the tangible reinforcer. When repeated over time, this pairing strengthens the impact of your social reinforcement. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the big show. I want to thank you all for tuning in. In the next show, we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring back the spirit of Alfred Marshall, and he's going to talk more of his principles of economics. I'm going to do more inspirational, motivational, 50-year-old disabled guy, instructional tips, instructional fitness tips for everyone out there. I'm going to be putting together another instructional fitness video while we listen to a channeling of Alfred Marshall's spirit, and then we're going to talk more about performance management too. I'm not sure when we're going to be getting to the next. But we're going to be talking more about tangible reinforcers coming up in the next show. So once again, thank you all for tuning in. Oh, shoot. Have a great day, everybody.